Yeah,
Live
Chicago
streaming,
one too.
setting it up for YouTube.
Yeah. No, this
And
is
you're
fine.
off,
Done
go
this
off
one.
screen, so you're not one of the desktop.
Yeah, this is better.
Okay.
Mhm. You can see the steam of my tea.
Okay. All right. Well, here we are at 10:03, 13 people. That's we could call that a magic number. So we'll get going here, and a few more people will trickle in, I assume. Okay. So, dear folks, I'm really thrilled that Mazin Qumsiyeh can be with us from Palestine today, so we can all learn a bit more about Palestine, a neglected topic in the U.S. educational system. And I'd like to introduce myself first. My name is Michael Pilarski. Some of you know who I am, but I've been working for 50 years in sustainable agriculture and ecosystem restoration. In 1978, I started Friends of the Trees Society, and in 2019 started the Global Earth Repair Foundation. And one of the first things we did was we put on a Global Earth Repair conference. I had first heard of Mazin about, maybe 4 years ago when our mutual friend, or Dana Vasali, mentioned, started sending me some of your writings. And so I was familiar with your work. And when we had this idea of putting on a panel on restoration in conflict zones or in war-torn countries, we may have said. So we invited Mazin to be part of that panel because he is doing restoration work in a conflict zone. And so that's when we first worked together. And then in 2022, he was going to come to the US and do a little tour and was looking for hosts. And so I said, well, I'll volunteer the Northwest. And unfortunately, that trip could not come to be. But as a result, we have Mazin here to do this webinar for for us here in the country. And so Mazin is the founder of the Palestine Museum of Natural History, and then the Palestine Institute of Biodiversity and Sustainability. And he has done just a lot of different kinds of work over the years. I know he does a lot of work cataloging different kind of critters and plants in Palestine. And you do a lot of surveys, you keep track of biodiversity. You have research staff and scientists and laboratories. You have gardening staff, I believe. I'm not sure how extensive that is. I know you work with a lot of community members. There's a lot of volunteers, and you do a lot of trainings. You train a lot of children. There's a lot of education, a lot of children, adults. And it's interesting when I look at the pictures of their trainings, I see that Mazin's usually in the front there. So I know he does a lot of the teachings personally. And I was really impressed when I just read the other day in his thank you says that he has 50,000 people on his email list that he's in touch with from around Palestine and far away places. So that's a really nice outreach. And so, Mazin, my hat is off to you, as they say here, that you've done such great work. And one of these days, we're going to start a Global Earth Repair Foundation Hall of Fame. And we're going to put all our heroes and heroines from around the world, like Wangari Maathai, and we'll add you to that list of the Hall of Fame. And so I'm thrilled to have you with us. And so take it away. And then I will say that anyone with questions is encouraged to put them in chat or to write them down so that you don't lose track of them. And Brendan, who is here with me, will be sort of tracking through the chat, and we will get to questions after Mazin's presentations a bit. So we will definitely have time for that. So thank you very much. And here we go.
Thank you very much for hosting this, for doing this. And I know it's a bit early. You're trying to accommodate me because of the time difference, and I really appreciate that. I'll try to make my presentation a bit short, and then because I do want to leave a lot of time for discussion, and sometimes the best ideas come during these discussions from the audience and others. So we would love to have your views and things like that. As you may know, I worked in the US for a long time. I was, at Duke and Yale universities in the medical schools. I came back to Palestine in 2008. And Jesse and I, my wife and I, started this Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability, a Museum of Natural History, etc., which we opened actually in 2017. But we started working on it in 2014. Now, one could spend a lot of time talking about problems here and symptoms of the problems. For example, when I was just looking back at 2021, as we usually do when the year ends, I noted that 86 Palestinian children were killed by the Israeli military, that there was some normalization of Israeli-Arab relations, like with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. There was the COP26 conference in Glasgow, which we actually worked a bit on as part of the Global South. We noted that Israel banned 7 human rights organizations here, including ones that work for children's rights, for women's rights, for prisoner rights. There were thousands of new settlement units that were built. Billions had flowed into the Israeli economy. Some 8,000 Palestinians are in Israeli jails. Many of them are not even allowed to see the biased Israeli judge. There has been occasional words from the UN, for example, 157 UN member states, vast majority, voted in favor of a resolution affirming Palestinian sovereignty over their natural resources. But of course, Israel doesn't care about any of this stuff at the UN and what it does, because it's shielded from international law by the US. The US uses a veto power anytime there's a resolution that attempts to punish Israel or do something. The other thing that happened in 2021, as you know, there were these demonstrations in Washington in which, ironically, Israeli flags were flying high, but also anti-Semitic T-shirts and anti-Semitic flags. Maybe not so surprising, because Israel is a racist state and it is supported by racists around the world. In terms of the COVID-19 in Palestine, these are some figures. We are in the midst of a new wave of COVID-19 in Palestine. The numbers are increasing and the situation is pretty bad. The healthcare services here are weak and they cannot handle much of this. We just celebrated the Eastern Orthodox Christmas early this month and the Western Christmas on December 25. My family is actually mixed. On my father's side of the family, it's Eastern dates. On the mother's side of the family, it's a Western date, so it's December 25. So we actually get 2 Christmases if you want. But they are not very pleasant Christmases, as you know, because we live under Israeli occupation. So if Jesus was coming to Bethlehem now, he would not be allowed to cross from Bethlehem to Jerusalem or to Nazareth because of walls and checkpoints and so forth. When I look at things like that, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about these symptoms of the problem, I do want to talk about earth repair, because that's what I was asked to speak about. Now, why is it that Palestine is important for earth repair? We are actually the bottleneck between Eurasia and Africa. Humans migrated out of Africa to the rest of the world through Palestine. So actually all your ancestors are Palestinians if you want, or Africans, depending on how far back you want to go. But also birds migrate through Palestine, annual migrations going back and forth between Eurasia and Africa. The area is very rich in habitats and very rich in biodiversity. This is why humans who settled here out of Africa were the first to actually invent agriculture, domesticate plants and animals, plants like barley, lentils, chickpeas, dates, palm, peas, pistachios, etc. This was about 12,000 years ago, 10,000 BC. That's why Jericho, by the way, is the oldest, one of the oldest. Some people argue it's Damascus is older, but one of the 2 or 3 oldest continuously inhabited towns on earth. The people of this country, the Palestinians, trace their ancestors going back to the first depictions of our people in hieroglyphics, for example, or in Mesopotamian reliefs where they showed the Canaanites. Canaanites is the name of our people. And the Canaanites with various tribes like Phoenicians, Nabateans, Jebusites, etc., were the ones who invented the alphabet that you use today from the Aramaic alphabet to basically evolve into the ABCs that you know. The A is shaped like an A because it's actually the shape of the Aleph, the bull with the 2 horns, you know. And if you flip it upside down, you get the A shaped like this. The B is for Beit, which is a house, a line and a half circle on it, so you get the B or a house. The K is for Kef, hand. G is for Jamal. R is for Ras, which means head, etc. This is the evolution of the alphabet. And the people continued to live here. We also, when we invented agriculture, we had time on our hands, so we invented things like civilizations and philosophy and laws and things like that. And the people continued to live here in relative peace and harmony for thousands of years. It's actually a falsehood to think of the Middle East as this cauldron of wars and conflict. We actually, as a percentage of our history, we had lower conflict than most areas on the globe and Earth, including certainly Europe, North America, etc., as a percentage of our history. Now, the latest part, we do have a conflict now. It's a conflict between the native Palestinians and a movement called Zionism. It's a very simple movement that basically argues that Jews need a country of their own and that Palestine is a logical place to do it. The problem for them is that Palestine was not a land without a people for a people without a land. Palestine was inhabited by its native people. And in order to create a Jewish state in Palestine, there has to be ethnic cleansing. So 530 Palestinian villages and towns were depopulated. You can see them on the red dots on the map on the right. And as a result, today there are 14 million Palestinians. 8 million of us are refugees or displaced people. And some of the refugees are also within the country because Israel also occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and proceeded to repeat the same process of ethnic cleansing and Judaizing that area. This process of change of the country is not unfamiliar to you, of course. You know that in the US, when Columbus, quote unquote, discovered America, I don't know why he had to discover it. But anyway, the US, what became known as the US, of course, was a land of native people, and slowly and meticulously and systematically, the natives were shrunk into smaller and smaller area, and many of them were killed, outright genocide or by diseases that the Europeans brought, etc. The same process happened in Palestine. The shrinking Palestine map on the top actually was inspired when my son in 1998, he was 13 years old. He saw the shrinking map of the US when he was in school in North Carolina. So the Palestinians now are left with 8.3% of the land in basically an apartheid system, a racist system that discriminates against non-Jews throughout historic Palestine, from the Galilee to the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Negev, and Gaza, of course, which is similar also to what happened in South Africa with the blacks relegated to what was called then Bantustans, countries for the Bantu people. The diagnosis here is called settler colonialism, and it is important to make the right diagnosis and not spend too much time talking about the symptoms of it, as I mentioned. The symptoms of it, I think you are very familiar with it. Even the propaganda around it, you are familiar with it, that the Europeans bring civilization, bring technological development, bring light, music, culture, books, etc. And the natives and their animals are not desired or flee or get killed or attack us for no obvious reasons because they are quote unquote savages or barbarians or something. And we only have to circle the wagons to protect these beautiful white people from the savagery of the native people who are terrorists or violent for an unknown reason. Maybe it's a language, maybe it's a religion. Well, we really don't care, but there is something there. And this is the language that they use, whether the Israelis or the whites in South Africa, Dutch in South Africa, or white European colonizers in North America, or Spaniards in South America. I'm going to skip some slides because I don't have much time. The settler colonialism has an impact on the environment also. As you know, the environment globally is impacted by many things. There are at least 5 major threats that are identified by the United Nations: climate change, habitat destruction, overexploitation of natural resources, invasive species, and what else? The pollution. So those are the 5 major threats that the world recognizes as we are all suffering from it, whether Palestinians or Israelis or Americans. We may add colonialism. In my opinion, that's a big global threat to the environment. Israel actually, when it destroyed the 530 Palestinian villages and towns, in many of those villages and towns, they uprooted all their trees, the diverse trees that they had, including like almonds, figs, carobs, hawthorn, olives, etc. They just bulldozed them and they planted in place of them pine trees. And that was because pine trees grow fast, Pinus halepensis, and thus cover up the crime of the destruction of the Palestinian villages and towns. One thing I might mention, when I say the diagnosis, settler colonialism, the prognosis is very clear. You have one of these 3 scenarios as a prognosis. You have the Algerian model where 1.5 million Algerians were killed and 1 million French moved to Europe. Many of the people who moved to Europe were 6, 7, 8 generations in Algeria. Some of them have never seen France in their life, but this is essentially a genocide. There is the genocide model outright, which happened in the US and Australia. And then there's the coexistence model, which is found in more than 150 countries in the world, like South America, Central America, Canada, Mexico, Pacific and Atlantic Islands, Southeast Asia, Northern Ireland, Southern Africa. These are the 3 scenarios for going forward. in my opinion, the third scenario being the most common globally, and the fact that scenario 1 and 2 are very, very unlikely to happen here, that leaves us scenario 3, which is, it's not kumbaya kind of thing, but it's what happens in most of the world. So we expect that to happen here. But, I mentioned that the threats that we have, like climate change and human habitat destruction, etc., are we should add settler colonialism to them. Now, you talked about earth repair, for example, and in my opinion, earth repair is very simple. We have to think of ourselves as just one more species on this planet, not a dominant species, not the one that's going to determine the outcome for everything else. We have to replace this ego with this unity. We are one, we need each other. Nature actually can live without us, but we cannot live without nature that we are destroying. This is just a picture to show you in the summer, this past summer, there were fires in the area of West Jerusalem and in the Galilee. The reason we have so many fires here is because I mentioned earlier that the Zionists planted pine trees to replace the Palestinian trees that they uprooted. And pine trees are, of course, very flammable. So here, for example, this area was burned. Ironically, it exposed the terraces that Palestinians had built long before 1948, and that Israel was trying to cover up with the pine trees. Other effects of colonization here on the environment are like the diversion of the Jordan River water from Lake Tiberias, basically stealing the water of the Jordan River to the western areas. This is before Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza. So they thought they needed to just drive the Palestinians out of the West Bank. And indeed, this impacted desertification, as you can see on the satellite image on the right, lack of water. Also, Israel in the 1950s, right after it was founded on stolen Palestinian land, drained the wetlands of the Hula area and deprived the people of that area, Lake Hula, of their livelihood and kicked them out. They became refugees, but also this deprived some, I think, 219 species that disappeared of animals in the Hula area. There is the theft of natural resources, as happened with the natural gas, the Dead Sea salt, the water, all of these things. Gaza, for example, is now besieged. The reason Gaza is besieged, where there's 2 million people undergoing a process that can only be described as genocide, because when you blockade 2 million people, most of them are refugees in a small 138 square kilometer area, you can imagine what will happen. Most of them are refugees. They don't belong in Gaza. But yet Israel kind of isolated them there and prevents even basic foods and medicine from getting to Gaza. This is the issue of water. You can see Palestinians actually get less than what the World Health Organization recommends for healthy living, which is 100 liters per day per person, whereas the Israeli settlers get 369 liters per day per settler. This is the hill behind me called Jabal Abu Ghneim, and what it looked like in 1997 on the top. And my family lost land in this area to these Israeli Jewish settlers. So you can see what it looked like in 1997 at the top, and what it looked like just a few years later when it got transformed to a Jewish-only colony of Har Homa. And we showed, some of my students and I and others, we show there's decline in vertebrate biodiversity in our region, etc. Other environmental injustice issues is that Israel builds its most toxic industrial settlements in areas like here near Brooklyn village, and some of my master students showed the impact on DNA damage and chromosome breaks. Now, this slide is just to remind me that I don't want to depress you too much. But you know, I feel sometimes like this black sheep, or that, you know, that's there, or black lemming that's saying, "Hey, stop! You're heading off to a cliff." Unfortunately, universities are not helping. They're taking bright young people who are intelligent and who have questioning attitude and want to become good citizens, and they make them into zombies. This is true whether it's of Palestinian universities or of Israeli universities or US universities, even the elite ones like Yale and Duke, where I was. Okay, so having given you a diagnosis and a prognosis with very minor symptoms, focusing on the environmental symptoms, how do we repair Earth? What do we do? I think you have to focus on three areas: research, education, conservation. That's what we at the Palestine Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability are doing. Along the lines of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I'm sure you're familiar with these 17 goals, including, you know, life on land, life on water, good health and well-being, etc. To achieve these sustainable development goals, we have to start with good research, because without good information, you're not going to be able to do much else in education or conservation or protection or anything else. So research has been a core function that we do at this institute. We now publish about 2 refereed scientific papers every month. This is the institute itself, drone image. By the way, I'm not allowed to have drones in the West Bank. So this is smuggled drone if you want. But we have a main building in the middle, you can see, with solar panels on it. We have greenhouses in them, at the bottom, and we have an animal room right above the greenhouse, and we have a botanical garden, etc. These are just some of the images from the Institute. We have a museum of natural history in which children come and enjoy animals. We have a small exhibit of ethnography, old farming tools, etc., that our Canaanitic ancestors used. The children enjoy seeing that. The older people remember even their parents or grandparents using these tools. Our philosophy is that children need to touch and feel and need to experience things to be able to affect the change. We are working on climate change issues, mitigation, adaptation. We have educational tools, including some animated videos, which I can send you if you are curious. We have brochures, etc. We work with the farmers to stimulate basically agriculture, even though farmers have seen their land and their water stolen from them by the Zionist colonizers. We try to show them that even on a small piece of land, they could do a lot if they follow permaculture and other principles. These are just some of the farmers we worked with. But even at the Institute itself, Palestine Institute of Biodiversity and Sustainability, we do have educational modules for sustainability. For example, we have a community garden. You can see in the lower right-hand side, children even can plant in it, etc., produce vegetables, etc., chicken eggs, fish from our aquaponic systems. The aquaponic systems, we developed them in 2016, and we actually brought some people from Gaza here. It was a miracle to get the permits for them to cross the borders that Israel put on us illegally, according to international law. because according to international law, people should have a right to move within their own country. But Israel doesn't allow us. For example, I'm not allowed to go to Jerusalem, even though I was a high school teacher in Jerusalem. And the only reason they don't allow me to go to Jerusalem is because I'm not Jewish. If I was Jewish from anywhere in the world, I could come live in Jerusalem on stolen Palestinian land, like in the Har Homa settlement that's behind me, I told you, and freely move anywhere they want to as Jews. We work with the women to encourage women entrepreneurs and making products and selling them. We work with children, for example, with summer camps. As I said, we like children to touch and feel and do things by hand. There's an old Chinese saying, I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. So we want them to do things, obviously, when they are here touching, feeling, exploring, etc. We have playground. We take them to the field sometimes. Kid in the upper right-hand corner is proud of the olive pickles that he just finished making. These are also kindergarten children learning about butterflies, for example. These are women who use organic plants to produce household products, including cosmetics, facial creams, and so forth in the Institute. So we try to empower women. We have an animal rehabilitation unit. Our motto at the Institute is respect. Respect for ourselves, respect for other human beings, and respect for animals, plants, and nature that sustains us. So we feel those three levels of respect are concordant and are important. These are just some of the people who work with us in the Institute, volunteers and staff. We have limited staff. I have only 8 employees, and Jesse and I are not employees, we're full-time volunteers. But these are just some of the other people in the Institute. We succeed because we have partnership with people of all backgrounds and institutions around the world. We even got a grant from National Geographic Society, the first and the last grant for Palestinians, basically. British Council, Royal Society, Natural History Museum in London, Darwin Initiative, many others, European Union supporters. We started an institute called Palestine, not an institute, a network, I should say, called Palestine Action for the Planet. We're part of, if you have heard of Extinction Rebellion, we work with Extinction Rebellion to lobby at the UN climate change, for example, etc. The bird, by the way, that you see at the lower right-hand corner is a Palestine sunbird, the national bird of Palestine, and the flower is the flower of the iris of Fakua, which is an endangered plant that's also the national plant of Palestine. The picture on the upper right-hand corner shows us with the Environment Quality Authority, because we are now working on a project to write the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. We could use your help, by the way, if anybody here wants to help us read sections of this. There's a lot of sections so far. There's 340 pages that have been written, which will detail for us going forward, how do we protect our nature, even under a scenario of continuing occupation, which seems to be the case now. These are just some of the people who come and visit the museum, spend time at the museum. These are just some of our staff and volunteers. Some volunteers from abroad, they come spend a little bit of time with us and do some education at the same time. That's called internship. For example, Julius Paul, who's operating our drone there in the deserts near Marsaba, published actually a paper on the orchids of the West Bank, and now he's going to do a higher degree on orchid conservation in Palestine. People who come here not only volunteer, but they also enjoy good company, good food. Here you can see in the lower right-hand corner, we're making apricot pickles. Here again, lower right-hand corner, we're eating together. Upper right-hand corners are some volunteers who managed to put together a biogas unit very quickly in one day. They managed to put it together to produce biogas for our kitchen. We have ambitious plans for a big museum of natural history. This is what it would look like, including a building to the north of us that the university decided to give to us to renovate and work on it. Our symbol is the Palestine sunbird, and this is a few years ago when we had snow here. We don't expect snow now that the climate change is happening. This is our website, info@palestinenature.org is the email, and the website is palestinenature.org. You can also follow us on Facebook with Palestine Museum of Natural History so that you can see what we do. This is me being arrested a few times by the Israelis. But anyways, I will stop here, and as I promised, I want to leave plenty of time for question and answer, so half the time or more will be for a discussion. So I'll stop sharing for now, and I'm happy to take some questions.
I was muted there. So a couple of comments is that we did put some resources for anybody that's watching on our Global Earth Repair website. So some of your writings and links and things are there, or at least they will be. I guess they're up already. And on that topic of COVID being really rampant there, it's probably the Omicron variant. I've been collecting information on COVID treatment, including, might say more homegrown treatments, different things that people can use. So I'd like to send you my sort of my updated list of things people can use if they get COVID that helps them. So I'll send that to you. If anybody else is interested, they could email me as well. What's our question situation here? Anything on chat? I haven't really looked.
So far, there's no questions in the chat room.
Okay, just where they're from. Right, people are putting down something like where they're from and stuff. Thanks. Nice to see that Erin is working in this field and how to contact her. And I'm assuming we're going to capture all this chat.
Yes.
And all this chat will be captured. Okay. So if anybody wants to, I have, of course, lots of questions and stuff, but maybe we'll let some other people here. If anybody would like to unmute themselves or if they want to raise their hand, there's that raise hand at the bottom of the panel there, the control panel. If people raise their hand, it usually brings them up where we can see them.
Grace Woods.
Okay, Grace Woods, would you like to unmute yourself? And I see Aaron is next.
Grace disappeared.
Oh, okay. Well, Aaron, I guess you're up then. I see.
They're saying, Peter is saying we don't see a mute button at the bottom. I don't know.
I'm seeing on my control panel on the far left there, my mute button.
Should be unmuted. You can unmute if I give you permission to unmute. So right now, Aaron has permission.
So maybe give everybody permission to unmute.
Can we give everybody permission?
Only 20 people.
Right. Yeah. Instead of having to go one. But anyway, Aaron's going to be first, but we're requesting that Brendan allow everybody to be able to do it without checking through. Do I have the pronunciation right, Aaron? Are you able to speak?
We might just have to say it out loud. Aaron says, what kind of approach would you like to see implemented to restore native biodiversity there?
Good question. First of all, I consider diversity to be both for human diversity and for nature diversity. And diversity is strength, whether it is in human communities or whether it's in natural communities. And Palestine has always been diverse throughout its history in both aspects, the human aspect and the natural aspect. Colonialism tried to damage that on both sides, on both fronts. For nature, I showed you some examples of the damage to nature. This happened also in North America when the Europeans, for example, killed some 2 to 3 million buffaloes because they were, the food for the Native Americans. So diversity of nature is impacted by colonialism. Diversity of humans are also impacted because clearly the intent of Zionism as a political movement was to take a country that was multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious, and even multilingual country and
Just froze.
Pardon, we're having some technical difficulties.
Mazin probably knows that he's frozen.
I would guess, yeah.
And hopefully we'll re-up and come back here shortly. And we haven't been able to solve the people being able to unmute themselves.
No, we haven't done yet.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll have that worked out by next time.
Okay. So anybody that wants to put in some messages here, just type them into their chat. At least we can see that. And I see Aaron's trying to.
Aaron should be unmuted. Maybe they need to pick the correct input next to the mute button. Might have to. There it is. See something?
There's.
Can you hear
So
me
Brent.
now?
We have other questions coming from other people, but they're from
Where-
Mazin.
Where are they?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, super. Sorry about that. I think it was actually a connectivity issue of my own. Yeah, so do we have any confirmation that Mazin can or cannot hear us yet?
We don't. Do we assume he's not on the screen?
You may need to call him.
I may need
See
to.
if he can get back online.
Well, if he's off, I'm sure he knows how to get back on it. But I don't know if we did, if we could even, if you can get through by phone, Brendan, go for it. I wouldn't.
Do we have his phone number right now?
And I don't have his phone number right now. I don't think. Let's see.
We did have some Israeli propagandist trolls in the YouTube chat, and they could have reported us.
It could. Yeah. So I don't know if you heard all that, Aaron, or is that pronunciation right?
It is. Yeah. Thank you. And yes, I did hear his response. Yeah, if I had an opportunity to reply to him, I would just inquire a little further regarding reflecting on some experiences of my own doing restoration work with indigenous groups in the southwestern United States, and the difference between a Western science approach versus a traditional ecological knowledge approach imposes some really important learning opportunities and sometimes challenges also for folks who might be coming into the restoration space in a place that is there to which they're not native. So, another question for Mazin was, what would be an appropriate way to get involved in, any way that would be seen as truly applicable and helpful. And what that looks like. Also, I wanted to just put myself forward as someone who'd be very willing if I could lend a hand in the review of the document that he and other biodiversity professionals are putting together, if he'd like additional expert opinion.
Oh, we have him coming back.
It looks like Mazin's coming back with a flashlight going. You have a power outage?
We had a power outage, yes. Another vagaries of the occupation.
We wondered if it was possibly deliberate, but glad to have you back with us. And
we're lucky because we had a volunteer here who has Wi-Fi on her phone.
Great. Well, hopefully this will all last now, and you'll be able to be with us for the remainder here. So where we're at, Mazin, is Aaron Moeller in Seattle has just volunteered to help you with your reading, and I can do that as well. And if anybody else wants to put in chat that they're willing to help, you can all contact Mazin directly for how to help. But if you'd like to say, Aaron's wanting to plug in and help, and so maybe I think it might be good for Mazin to hear you repeat your question about working with indigenous.
I think I get it. I can finish the answering that question. But I just did also put my email in the chat room so that people can email me, send me their email, so that I can stay in touch with you about whether you are helping or not helping, even just to stay in touch. But to talk about diversity, what I was saying when the electricity went off, basically diversity is strength, whether it's in nature or whether it's in human society. And colonialism was and always is against this kind of diversity, against sustainability of people and nature together. So what is our job and how do we challenge this is basically what you were asking. And I think it's very, very simple. First of all, we have to set a model of strengthening people's connectivity to the land through things like permaculture, through things like recycling, upcycling, and stuff like that. So I think that's important. But I also think it's important to challenge hegemony and racism wherever we see it, whether it's in the United States or whether it's here. And on that note, I want to say that the US is complicit in what Israel is doing here, because the US sends billions and billions of dollars of our tax money. I say our tax money because I'm also a taxpayer. I'm a US citizen. Even though I live here for the past 13 years, I still have to pay taxes in the US. So our tax money is being used to support oppression. So we, the American public, are complicit in this. And of course, our government also uses the veto power at the UN to shield Israel from international law. So that's why it's our responsibility as citizens, wherever we are, to challenge this hegemony and to help people survive and help nature survive. As I said, it's, nature can live without us, but
the last bit of that speaking wasn't audible there.
Sorry.
Okay, back. Okay,
So there's another question here from Anastasia. Are you working in neighboring countries, Jordan and Lebanon, to support similar efforts there?
We were actually consulted in neighboring countries and even faraway countries like Uganda and Kenya and Egypt and Jordan and the United Arab Emirates to show them what we have done and how we have done it so that they can emulate it in their countries. So yes, I would love to do more of that. It's just, the time limits that we have, and then this COVID that prevented us from traveling for the past 2 years has been devastating to us in terms of collaborations.
Okay, so we have another question from an anonymous attendee. Are there any projects going on using farming / agroecology as a means of both rebuilding ecosystems and organizing against occupation and/or promoting traditional Palestinian knowledge and land practices?
Looks like he's.
Yes, I think that's a very good question.
Looks like you're broken down again there. Oh.
Well,
Seems to be flashing in and out. An unstable connection.
Can you move near a window, maybe?
Can you move near a window, maybe?
let me turn off the video because sometimes having video streaming will take some bandwidth.
Yeah, that's true.
So, you don't need to see my ugly face anyway. It is very important because I give you an example. Natives have this knowledge that has been developed through thousands of years. For example, planting basil between other vegetables. Basil has a very nice smell for humans, but for insects, it's an insect repellent. This is from the knowledge of our ancestors. My grandfather used to cultivate, and there are even proverbs and other things. But as I said, we're a fertile crescent where humans developed agriculture. So this kind of knowledge is very useful, and we don't want to lose it. We don't want to lose, for example, the varieties of seeds of local plants because Monsanto or other Israeli companies have, now I see that electricity is back. But anyways, that's good. So yes, indeed, this is very important for us. We are planning to develop a center for ethnoecology, which is the study of cultural heritage related to plants and animals. And this will be very useful. Are you there?
We got most of that. Still a little bit cutting in and out, but we got almost all of it.
This going from.
But now not so good. Yeah, it's unfortunate that this is cutting in and out. It's always hard when you're in a occupied territory and things don't work as smoothly as in the occupier's territory. But I hope that anytime you can get through to us again, Mazin, we'd love to hear more because we still have a half hour to go here.
Go ahead and read the next question.
Okay, so Mahala says, I find myself experiencing intense grief and realizing that it probably comes from my own ancestral traumas with the different diasporas in my lineage. For a lot of people, this is probably stopping them from engaging. So ancestral trauma runs deep in many of us. And of course, the Palestinians are certainly having a big diaspora, and there's a lot of trauma that needs to be healed. And that's a process that I think is possible. but it's harder to do it when you're still being traumatized. And so we need to get to a world where the traumas are stopped, and so that we can sort of catch up on the backlog of healing that needs to be done. And I think without re-traumatizing people from birth, as is currently done, that we can make some good headway within a couple of generations. What do you think, Mazin?
Yes, I think it's very critical. I tell my students at the university that, first of all, you have to work on your own self before you try to liberate yourself. You have to liberate your mind. You have to get over whatever hanging chains that you have on your head. In the civil rights movement in the 1950s, they used to say, free your mind and your ass will follow. And Stephen Biko was once said that he's South African activist, of course, against apartheid. He once said that the best weapon in the hands of the occupiers is the mind of the occupied. So if they colonize our minds, they have won, basically. And we have to start with our own selves. We have to look at ourselves, our traumas, our injuries, and try to heal ourselves, first of all. Peter Barris is there and the group of people. One time, he and I and a Native American were discussing actually these issues. And I think they're very important for healing, that we, first of all, we cannot bottle up hate or wanting revenge or anything like that. We have to expect from ourselves at least, that hate and anger only hurt us. It doesn't mean we shouldn't work against colonization, against oppression, but we do it as Jesus said, love your enemies. He didn't mean you love what they do to you. No, I don't love what they do to us, and I challenge what they do to us. But at the same time, I don't hate them. Even the Israeli soldier who kneeled with his knee on my neck and my ribs and cracked my rib, and I was in pain for a whole week after, I don't hate him. I think, I feel pity for him. I feel sorry for him. I feel he's sort of like a cousin of mine who was addicted to drugs and alcohol, that he needs treatment. This is how I feel. And I think if we all do the same, if we all think that way, that we challenge the evil, but we never want to hurt even the evildoers, so to speak. We want them to change their behavior. That's essentially what Desmond Tutu, who is, I spoke at his church in South Africa, actually Anglican church in South Africa. He died recently. And Mahatma Gandhi, of course, and Martin Luther King, and many others. I think their philosophies are the correct philosophies in terms of, first, we have to deal with ourselves and our, quote unquote, fix somebody else. And I'm not sure I want to fix anybody. I'm barely able to handle myself. Let alone
Okay. And yeah, we're currently up. That you froze there for a little bit. So I will just say, I was at a workshop just the other day, and the person was commenting on how many people are domesticated by a lot of the schooling system. And so, and that we need to have more rewilding, they called it. How can humans access the wild within themselves? As you said, if people's minds are colonized, they can't, they're really at a disadvantage. And the fact that we've been so so many of us have been so domesticated. And so I always have a lot of hope in the world for places like people in places like Africa and Palestine, and places where maybe the domestication process has not been so thorough as it is here in our developed countries. Maybe the development is a development of domestication of human beings as part of the problem. But anyway, that's just a little thought there on domestication and rewilding among people.
Yeah, I mean, and I think when you mentioned you had done some work on COVID-19, my mind started going in that direction. And I was thinking, you know, as a biologist, I can tell you that the reason COVID-19 kills many people is that these people are living unhealthy lives. They are living lives where their immune system is suppressed, where they don't, as children, they didn't play in the dirt. When I was a kid, we used to even eat dirt, which is healthy, by the way. You know, you need that natural immunity that's developed in wilding humans, if you want, going back to nature, instead of living in these, you know, concrete chicken coops that they force us to live in, sometimes in the major cities. So I think there is a lot to be said for that. I mean, if you look, for example, compare why the death rate among northern Italians is worse than the death rate among southern Italians. The reason is very simple. There's more pollution in northern Italy than in southern Italy, which is along the Mediterranean, etc. There's much cleaner air and so on. So I think people have to start paying attention to their food, to their air, to their water that they drink. And this is what brings you health and also psychological health, I would say. So this is how I look at it, is we need to, I mean, people are talking, let's go back to what things were before the COVID-19. Sorry, I don't want to go back to what it was before the COVID-19. It was horrible. We were like those lemmings, as I said, we were heading down the cliff. COVID should have given us an opportunity to reflect and rethink. You have to have, I mean, I was just reading yesterday, some 600 scientists signed a statement saying precisely what I've been thinking. I was not one of the people who signed, but I should sign, which is that we have to have a global transformation, a global change in the way we do things. We cannot do things the way we were. It's not acceptable. There is a message from Erin again at CS. Are you aware about seed conservation efforts? Yes, we are doing seed conservation, native species conservation, genetic resources. This is also part of the strategy with the National Agricultural Research Center and many others that we in the committee that's overseeing forming the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan are putting into operation. And then Riker says agriculture accounts for about 70% of total freshwater usage worldwide. Given the limits on water availability in Palestine, what approaches are we using to maximize productivity with minimal water usage? Well, one example I cited is aquaponic systems, which we train some Gaza people to do, because within a very small system with very little evaporation of water, you can grow fish and you can grow vegetables at the same time. The nitrogen and other nutrients from the fish urine and feces basically are used by these plants and are filtered by the plants, which then come back to the fish as clean water. So there is this cycle and very limited addition water that does that. So, and this is just one of many, many examples. We also have hydroponics, aquaculture, soil erosion protection, composting, all of these things, even compost toilet that we're building now at the museum. And so there's many things that can be done. And then from Jason, he says, can you describe the plant communities habitats of the orchids your institute studies? How much wild lands are left in the region that support this? The work that Julius, the German intern who spent a couple of months in the height of the COVID-19 with us during the last winter season, documented, I think, 24 species of orchids in the West Bank. Some of them are fairly rare. And the habitats mostly around the Mediterranean zone. Now we have 4 phytogeographical regions, maybe 5 if you count the coastal region, but the 5 are Mediterranean, Irano-Turanian, Saharo-Arabian, and Sudanese penetration or Ethiopian elements that come along the Jordan Valley, along the Great Rift Valley from Africa. So these are different habitats. We have the lowest point on Earth, of course, near the Dead Sea, and there's one orchid species that we discovered there. So there's different habitats, but most orchids love the Mediterranean climate, and the diversity of orchids in the Mediterranean region is high. That's why the Convention on Biological Diversity and the IUCN, International Union of Conservation of Nature, recognize the Mediterranean climate as hotspot for biodiversity that needs to be protected.
So a couple of words on the water situation there, seeing as how a lot of the surface water has been shunted off by the Israelis, and so you're left with the crumbs, so to speak. But there's always some water that falls, and there's water harvesting strategies. And so in permaculture, we get trained in a lot of different kind of water harvesting strategies and how to make do with little bits of water. And I can certainly forward some of that information. I'm sure that Mazin and his people are well aware of some of them, and I'm sure that there are traditional systems there, which I would love to know more about. So I could say that we could increase agricultural productivity and restoration and improvement of native habitats in Palestine. Even, you know, I would say it's not anywhere near an impossible task, but the problem is they're living under occupation. And I'm going to mention a book I just read called More People, Less Erosion. It's a book about a place in Kenya where the population, the land was degraded and things were not good, a lot of erosion. And then the population increased about 5 or 6 times on top of that. And in the process of the people adapting, they intensified agricultural production and took care of the erosion and made the ecosystems much healthier, even with 5 or 6 times the population. In other words, population, you might say, could be an asset as well as a hindrance. But the key to success there, the reason that they were able to turn it around is that the people got land tenure. They were able to own and have control of their own land. And when you actually give people control of their land, they will do long-term things. But as long as they're sharecroppers, you might say, or under colonization, then they can't, or it's hard for them to do that that restoration. So that's why Mazin, and they know what to do, I believe, I'm sure, but it's the capability to be able to do it under occupation that's the problem.
Absolutely. This explains why before 1948, Palestinian economy was heavily dependent on agriculture. 70% of the people made their living from agriculture. Today, less than 7% of Palestinians, 1/10 of the previous number, have make their living from agriculture. This is because, very simple, as you pointed out, stripping them of their land and title to the land and their resources, their water, and their soil and everything else. So yes, this is a big problem, and most colonialists, they don't understand this, and they don't want to deal with this issue because they really don't care. As far as they are concerned, Native people might as well go to hell. We don't want them. We want this land. We want the land without the people. So that's their intention.
Yes, very sad. So I see. Here's a deep question here. I am from Yao, and I will just read her thing here. I am originally from Israel, married to a Native American, share a lot of your love and concerns about that part of the world, and probably some differences. I am wondering if you would be open to conversation around conservation with people from the other side who see you in nature not as our other, but as our other selves. So how, I think what they're asking, well, you can see that, but do you have much interaction with Israelis on the other side when you work together?
Yes, and I have Zohar, for example, is living with us for the past year, full-time volunteer like me at the Institute, an Israeli born in a kibbutz. When I was arrested more than 12 times, half the times I was arrested with Israeli citizens who were standing with me in front of bulldozers trying to uproot 1,000 or 2,000-year-old olive trees or houses or things like that. So yes, we work, this is what's called joint solidarity. Joint solidarity is more than welcome. What we don't welcome is normalization, like what happened with the Bahrain or United Arab Emirates, where Israel uses these things to say, I don't know what you're talking about. Everything is hunky-dory. Here we are collaborating. We have ambassadors in those countries. We are doing, everything is fine. So why worry about the situation? And you're not allowed to discuss apartheid. You're not allowed to discuss the right of refugees to return to their homes and lands. These are all taboo subjects that are not allowed to be discussed. So yes, we work with Israeli scientists, for example. We welcome working with them. They come and give me advice. I give them advice on their work. But I cannot put my name on a paper, research paper, for example, where it shows the Hebrew University with Bethlehem University, because the Hebrew University or Tel Aviv University, for that matter, are complicit in the occupation and the colonization. They support racism and they support these aspects. So we don't want to have normalization that makes it look like business as usual. So individual collaborations are welcome, individual interactions are welcome, individual joint solidarities. If we have organizations on the other side, and we do have some of them, who are willing to support basic human rights like the right of refugees to return, or against the home demolitions, against the Israeli military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, organizations like B'Tselem or Israel Committee Against Home Demolitions, or breaking the silence, Israeli soldiers who break the silence about what they are ordered to do, then these are organizations we more than welcome and collaborate with, and we do it almost every day. So again, it depends on the nuances of the subject and who we are talking about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mazin.
I'd love, by the way, to engage more in discussion of this with this gentleman if he wants. After I left my email again, and I'm happy to connect with you and discuss more about what we do. I also highly recommend the book by Elon Tal, Israeli environmentalist, who wrote a book about pollution in the promised land and what Israeli policies regarding environmental issues. When this settlement was being built here behind me, I wrote to all Israeli NGOs and governmental organizations, telling them this is damaging the only green area between Bethlehem and Jerusalem. Please don't build a settlement there. Not one of the supposedly green organizations in Israel was willing to speak to their government or pressure their government on this. They all followed the party line of Zionism, that this is important to ring Jerusalem with Jewish-only colonies, and this is good for history of Zionism, things like that. So it's hypocrisy to say that you are Israel Nature Society, but you are not willing to speak against the destruction of nature, when that destruction contradicts with your government's stated goal of ethnic cleansing.
Mm. Yeah.
We have a question.
You were trying to get to a question here. Anyway, he's looking for it here. So one thing a couple of comments here. I've always been really like to say that restoration, we need restoration that feeds people. So we need to restore the environment, but in many parts of the world, it also has to feed the people because there's not enough local food. And so I mentioned to Mazin some time back in one conversation that how much wild foods are still eaten in the area? How many edible weeds are there still growing in the area? And can they be increased in the environment by judicious sowing of seeds in waste areas or whatever? How can we increase the amount of wild foods, preferably native? But if a lot of the a lot of the wild foods that I eat are what we call weeds, and they're non-natives. I'm sure I won't go as far as to say to bring in any new non-native edible weeds, but which one of your weeds that are currently around are edible, and how do you utilize the weeds is always one of my topics I like to go into. And also, how do we increase the amount of perennial food crops that are in the environment? And as you say there, if the Israelis are bulldozing old olive trees and almond trees and the fruit trees of the people, it is so irritating because as a permaculturist, I want to see us planting wild fruit trees and nut trees, etc., throughout the landscape so that they can be wild, but they're available for harvest. Is there still the potential to be doing that?
A great potential, because as I said, we are part of the Fertile Crescent. That's where many of the domestication of plants, including wheat and barley, when you drink a beer next time, please remember, thanks Palestinians, ancestors, the Canaanites, for inventing these things, for inventing wine and things like that. This is our history, and it's very rich history. Now, indeed, there are 4,000 some species of plants in Palestine, and many of them could be domesticated if you want, but certainly could be harvested from the wild, and there are many, many such plants that could be harvested from the wild. Israel, ironically, that's why I'm very frustrated by the notion of like Israel Nature Authority, they call it. Israel Nature Authority, which is a Zionist program, basically, that uses nature, also the Jewish National Fund, uses nature as a weapon, basically. for example, as I said, uprooting native trees and planting pine trees, or telling Palestinians they cannot harvest, for example, za'atar, the thyme, the oregano, because they said, well, your harvesting can destroy this wild species. Well, no, I mean, the Palestinians have been harvesting it for thousands of years before Israel and can do it after Israel. It is not an issue. The issue for me is, which you pointed out, is how much control we have. If we don't give the natives control, of course, one of the things that happen, and this has happened, unfortunately, when they are taken from the land and become indentured laborers in Israeli settlements and so forth, they stop caring about nature. They stop caring about wildlife. They start to even hunt wildlife or overfish or over harvest things from the wild, because they have been taught, indoctrinated to think that this is a hopeless situation. We've been under colonization for 73 years and we just have to live, so may as well get a job with an Israeli, building manufacturer. Even if the builder is building a wall around their house, they still go and get employed. This is what I call mental colonization. They have become mentally colonized, and this was a systematic process that was done to them to strip them from that connectivity to the land as native people. So I think we have to reverse this and we have to work on it. It's not easy, it's very, very challenging, but we do have a project now funded by the Swiss government that's precisely to do what you are talking about, which is to show people that there are some wild plants that could be harvested. My mother, who lives downstairs, is 90 years old. And I remember when I was a kid, she used to take us to the valley next door, harvest snails, for example, right after rains. And we eat those snails, harvest plants in the spring and cook them, like spinach, but they are greens that are collected from nature, but they're not spinach, they are just wild plants. And she used to know which plants are edible, which plants are not edible, which plants are good for what ailments, medicinal plants, all of this stuff. Nature is beautiful pharmacy. And we have to go back to that. We have to reconnect people to this cultural ethno-ecology, as I call it, history, that can help them, that can also help them psychologically as they regain sovereignty over their resources and over their livelihood, don't have to be dependent on Israeli income, so to speak.
So I have one more, closing remark here a little bit, but also one thing I noticed when I was reading your stuff, Mazin, was that you mentioned growing food or growing plants on walls and rooftops and balconies. And looking at the housing in Palestine, I see there's just so many walls and a lot of flat rooftop. There's a lot of space available, and every building is a runoff zone. So if you catch the water that falls on the building and put it to grapevines or certain things that can grow next to buildings, you can use the buildings as the growing space. And that's a lot of production, and it's right where the people live.
Absolutely.
And so I really commend you on that thought. And I hope that you get a division someday that is just like specializes in roof and wall production and really help spread that around. Would be one good thing.
Yes. No, I agree. And it's, as I said, even when people grow a few plants on their balcony or in their kitchen windowsill or something, psychologically, they also feel better. They feel that, humans are by nature, especially our people, are by nature I mean, in the refugee camp, I saw people growing, along the stairs, along stairwells, along walls, along, it gives them a sense of connectivity to Earth that has been forced, against their will to be disconnected from Earth as refugees, mostly refugees. Most Palestinians are refugees.
So we're about closing time here, but I just wanted to say to you and to the group here is that in preparation for this workshop, I did some research on which countries in the world are currently having wars or have recently had wars, because I mentioned how can we do restoration in conflict zones or in recent conflict zones. And there's the Middle East and North Africa has so many conflict zones or recent ones that's really damaged the ecosystems and damaged the people. And in a sense, and I'm sure there probably are these things, but a way of networking between people who are doing restoration and sustainable agriculture who are working in conflict zones currently or are repairing the damage. I think that you could learn from Afghanistan and Syria and so many other countries that have the same kind of issues, and how in a sense it's world solidarity. And there's a World Social Forum, but what are, it makes me want to do some more research on world civil society, especially the oppressed, getting together, sharing success stories and sharing stuff. That's, whatever, you could send us some more information on what actually is going on in that regard, because unfortunately the world has way too much of it, folks. And anyway, we should all do what we can.
I mean, I agree with you. One of the things that they did to us was disconnect us from each other. And I was lucky in that I traveled to something like 45 countries, visiting places which have those intentional communities. There's one I stayed at for a while in Luck, Wisconsin, for example, a farm in which dozens of people are living and thriving, essentially almost off the grid. Tamera in Portugal, for example, you can look it up, Tamera, Portugal. Another intentional communities. There's the Zapatistas in Mexico who are living life as they should be as native people, separated from the vagaries of rampant capitalism that's destroying our planet. So there are thousands and thousands of these examples. And all we have to do is just look for them and network with them and work with them to affect a change. And building this network is important if we are ever to stem this impending, doomsday. We're close to midnight, as I say, either from nuclear weapons. And I worry about what's happening with the US flexing its muscles and Ukraine and all of this, and Russia bringing troops to the border, and NATO expanding around Russia. So we could go extinct with the global nuclear catastrophe, or we could go extinct as a species, or at least as organized human existence. Who was it, Einstein or somebody, who said, I don't know what the next war will be fought with what weapons, but I know the war after that will be fought with sticks and stones. So, if we, with climate change and all of that stuff, I mean, it's really bad. And we have to get our act together seriously, quickly, and stop this nonsense of Shia versus Sunni, Jews versus Muslims, this versus that. This is ridiculous, and the greedy people are getting rich off of this. I mean, Israel, by the way, 25% of its population is under the poverty line. while people like Netanyahu and Gantz and these guys are multimillionaires. You know, they don't care about what happens to to their public or to the Palestinian public or to nature for that matter. All they care about is themselves. And I can say the same thing about Palestinian leaders like Abu Mazin, corrupt, you know, a guy who stays in power because the CIA and the Mossad like him to stay in power. But he doesn't care about the environment or about nature or about people or about any of the stuff that you and I care about.
I'm seeing a question here from Anastasia. So we're a little bit over our 11:30 time here, but we'll continue a little bit longer here as long as people wish. I see that we're currently at 16 yet. Anastasia Nut says, if you feel, as you stated in the slides, that the model involving integration in Israel-Palestine is the one most likely to occur versus the other two described, how do you currently envision this in your heart of hearts? So that's from Anastasia, who I will say is a friend of mine and has gone to Israel and Israel many times to work with Israeli and Palestinian women together for peace and spiritual progress, you might say. So Anastasia asked this question from a place of deep understanding of the situation. So how do you envision this in your heart of hearts?
Thank you. Because of time limitations, I am going to put my website that has the answer to it, which is Qumsiyeh.org. If you go there, there's a book called Sharing the Land of Canaan, Human Rights and the Israeli-Palestinian Struggle. I put my information, my writings on my website. I'm not particularly a fan of copyright. My publisher is not happy about this, but don't tell them. But anyways, Sharing the Land of Canaan, which somebody also, Yael just put in the chat. You can read in there about the vision of this. Now, this was written in 2002, published 2004. If I was writing it again, I would write it slightly different, but that's another issue. But it's by and large still valid in terms of saying that basically to get to peace, we have to have human rights. And it's not an issue of saying one state, two state confederations, this or that. If you don't respect human rights, like the right of refugees to return to their homes and lands, then you are never going to have peace. There's always going to be conflict. Or if you disconnected the people from their land and you don't want them to come back to the land, you're afraid of diluting a quote-unquote Jewish majority, that's a problem. It's racism, in my humble opinion. I think there's plenty of space here for all people. I don't think there's, and this book argues very convincingly, I think, that there's plenty of space for everybody, that we should have secular laws that respect all religions, that protect the rights of majorities and minorities, not just majorities. And that's it. And it can be done. It's not magical. It's not, human rights. There's a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which even Israel signed on to and the US signed on to, but they violate just about every provision of it. Universal Declaration of Human Rights, written in 1949 by actually a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust. Brilliant document. The only thing I would improve on it is economic rights, but that's another issue. But overall, it's an excellent document, and it should be implemented. So if we want peace here in Palestine/Israel, if you want, all we have to do is implement the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Very good. May it be so. I'm going to give a quote here from Mazin on his 12 recommendations for good health. I recommend that to all of you. And his number 12 is be kind to all and never give up, especially on the potentiality of the future. No matter the challenges, keep the hope alive. And so I think that really says a lot for you, Mazin. Never give up, keep the hope alive. And that's what we have to do. We have no other choice, really, because we love the creation. And we have to work for the good of all and the whole web of life. And anyway, it's great to hear from you today and benefit from your wisdom. And I think we'll call it. I think we're about ready to call it good. Maybe you have a parting a little bit to say here, Mazin, and I think we'll close up and everybody can.
Yeah, I would love to network with everybody on this call. So I left my email again in the chat. Originally, I sent it just to the host, but I guess now I sent it to everyone in the chat. So you can see my email and write me. And I'd love to connect with you and work with you to bring us closer to sustainability, which is what we all want. Thank you.
Thank you. And I don't know if people can unmute themselves, but if anybody wants to, and if they can, we can say goodbye and thanks. But thank you very much. And I'm glad that the people were able to join us here.
Allowing everybody to talk and unmute.
Yeah, people can now are allowed to unmute if they wish.
Thanks very much for the talk.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was beautiful.
Thanks. Take care, everybody, and come visit us. We provide room and board for volunteers. So if any of you want to volunteer, we have good food, good accommodations, we would welcome you.
Good
Thanks,
company.
Mazin.
Thank you.
Count me in.
Shukran.
All right.
Bring my shovel.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye. All right. Love to everybody.
Much love.